Good morning. Oh, hello. Thank you so much for coming and joining us this morning. So this conversation, like many great conversations, began at a bar, well, a restaurant, but I'm pretty amazed that we made it from a restaurant to a church. It was a few months ago, the four of us, and I'm so pleased to be joined by my colleagues, but more importantly, friends. We had this incredible conversation in New York, and it was a few months and a whole era ago, because it was before the elections in the United States. And we had this really fascinating conversation where we basically, I'm a little bit fuzzy on the details, because a lot of wine was drank, and none of us could quite remember what it was that it was said. But the bigger outline of it was really about how, even though we couldn't come from more different backgrounds. I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore. I come from Georgia. I was born in the Soviet Union. We talked a lot about how the experience of oppression in very, very different contexts created some of the very shared realities for us, even though, you know, the struggles are very different, but there was a lot to relate to. And I think that's what we wanted, and Sarah, you'll explain why we called the panel what we called it, but that's what we want to sort of carry on talking about. But before we do, you know, we are today in a very different place from where we were a few months ago when we were having this conversation, and we're seeing extraordinary dismantling of freedoms and the progress that has been made for, you know, your communities in the US, but for, you know, wider Americans as well. You know, to me, I now live in America, and, you know, it's amazing to me to watch how, you know, I have this very distinct feeling that, like, I've seen this movie before. We don't know how it ends, but, you know, the authoritarian playbook kind of plays out in very similar patterns. And a few weeks ago, Sarah, that's what I would like to start with. We were at a conference, and it was a gathering also of journalists in the United States, and you went along to the room, and everyone was discussing, like, what do we do now? And you raised the diversity issue and said, what are we going to do about the backlash against the DEI? And what you got, it was essentially a collective eye roll, which that was not the time to talk about it, was the response. And to me, that is astonishing, because it seems to me like that is the front line of the battle that is being fought by the Trump administration. For them, it's the front line, and yet there has been such, like, caving in and the dismantling from people who have been supportive of it in the past. Can you start by talking about that?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, thank you, Natalia. It's just amazing to be on a stage with three of my favorite people in the world. The collective eye roll that Natalia is referencing, I am so used to the collective eye roll. You know, like, my whole career has been one big collective eye roll, because I'm always the one who is raising, what about Black people? What about, you know, white supremacy and systemic oppression? And as some of you in here know, that engenders a lot of, like, come on, get over it. Are you kidding? That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about safety and you know, like jobs and other things. And so DEI, which is, like, you know, from my lens, is really I look at DEI from the standpoint of equality, justice, liberation, opportunity. I don't look at it as like this thing that you're checking a box and you're just like trying to satisfy something. And so I have spent a lot of time being in rooms that did not want to hear about the issues that are most important and most relevant to me and my community, and advocating them, even though I know that they're going to be, it's an inhospitable environment. But at the end of the day, you know, and I was very vocal in that room because I felt like the entire conference did not appropriately address DEI. You know, it was shrouded. And I think that we are in a time when we need to be taking these things head on. It cannot be, we cannot tiptoe around them, we cannot decenter them. And to your point, you know, the dismantling or like the embrace, I will say, of white supremacy and anti-Black racism in this current moment has to be called out. You know, in 2020, everybody was like, you know, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Well, obviously they don't. And we as Black Americans have spent 400 years advocating for our humanity. And so what's happening right now is a continuation. So we're not shocked, we're not amazed, we're continuously heartbroken. It's like, really, again, already? But we have muscle memory around this bullshit. And let's go. We gotta do the work.
Hoping to talk more about what work is, but bringing both of you and kind of jump in, Martin and Karen. What do you think? Like you say, like, yes, it's been 400 years, but it's also what's happening is also unprecedented because we're really rolling back a lot of the progress that has been made, including from, you know, companies. And I was walking with, you know, meeting with someone from LinkedIn who was saying that they're, you know, going to be canceling all just getting rid of all the DI language. Obviously, the, you know, funders are asking grantees to take that language out. So there's a lot of, for me as an outsider in the United States, I'm amazed to see how quickly, on especially the DI front, everyone is sort of backing down.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. So at the Maynard Institute, we focus on training diverse journalists, those particularly in leadership and in management. And it's an organization that's almost 50 years old, based in Oakland, California, but we work across the country. And we explicitly focus on journalists of color. Many of the organization's it's interesting, founders of the organization, among them, one who is still on our board, Dorothy Gilliam, who was the first Black woman reporter at the Washington Post in 1963. And I was talking with my colleagues about my own journalism journey, which when I was coming up, the focus was get into these institutions, these journalistic institutions like the New York Times or Washington Post, these sort of stalwarts of journalism, because there was a need to address the harm that these organizations had inflicted on communities of color, Black communities and the like. And what we have seen in this time now is actually that there's a lot to be learned from Black media, in particularly in how it has approached proximity and relationship to community. At a time of great distrust, these institutions that are supposed to inform, that are supposed to tell the story, for many are less trusted than ever. And there's been these efforts over these years to have diversity programs in these organizations, in journalistic institutions, as well as what we saw in 2020 with DEI proliferating the conversation. And it's what's so disheartening and upsetting is that, in fact, Black struggle is a struggle to help all. If you think about the priorities of folks of color, of black folks, has been around, well, what's good for us tends to be good for all. We want fair housing, we want education, we want to be treated with respect and have love and peace. And these things feel like they are under assault. And what is upsetting in this moment of capitulation is for what I feel, when people have asked us at the organization, well, 70% of what is on our website would run us afoul of the executive orders that we've seen emerge out of the Trump administration. So in some ways, this moment, after about 6 weeks of being despondent in January and just like, I can't believe this is happening, has also been incredibly clarifying, because we can't change the language. If you change the language, you change the story. And we're not changing the story. And so it's very clear that we have to stand up, but there are people right now who haven't had to have this fight. They have not had to be where we are. And I'll close with this piece, is that in many ways my generation is basking in the glow of a civil rights generation. And so we came up through the fruits of those labors, and that many, in realizing that for many, they start struggles that they never see the fruits of. And we were living in that time. And so we were saying this, and Sarah may disagree, but I feel that in fact the backlash against diversity is an indicator of progress.
I personally was not shocked, and I am not shocked about anything that America does in its infinite struggle to maintain this image of white superiority and white supremacy. We have fought. Black Americans have been fighting since we've got to this country. We would like to think that we could rest on the successes that our parents have made and our ancestors have made towards equality, but we can't. So we're exhausted, but we will prevail. And one of the things we were talking about earlier today was that Black Americans have been very successful at building our own institutions, our own media outlets. I work in film festivals, I work at Black film festivals, and our own community. So in times like this, I think our strong point is going to be doubling down on making sure that we're solid and that we're committed to telling our stories and making sure that we're being seen in our fullness and not just reduced to the stereotypes and the tropes that white supremacy is dependent upon in order to suppress us.
Sarah, it's often that moments of crises, and there is clearly a crisis. There's a crisis for the movement that you have been part of. There's a crisis for the industry that there's a crisis for the country and the world. And sort of the time of great uncertainty overall. Do you feel for your work there is also an opportunity in it?
So just to say what my work is, so I've been a Black media entrepreneur my entire career. I never worked at the New York Times. I never worked at mainstream media. And right now I am the president, CEO, and owner of a Black talk radio station in Philadelphia called WURD. And I'm also the co-founder and president of a startup called URL Media, which stands for Uplift, Respect, and Love. And it's a network of Black and brown media organizations that share content and revenues to try and create more economic sustainability for Black and brown media organizations in the US. Do I see an opportunity? Absolutely. I think that out of great struggle, what did Frederick Douglass say? Without struggle, there's no progress. And so we are in an era, we are at the beginning of a new era of incredible struggle that is born out of threat and intimidation and repression and all of these things. And so, if you do not identify and find the opportunity in that, you will die. You will buckle, you will wilt. And that's not an option. And to Karen's point, it's exhausting. Because this work, my work as a Black media entrepreneur, has always been difficult. We've always been under-resourced, under-acknowledged, undervalued, all of it. But this is a different level of, this is an all-out attack. And to Martin's point, like, we can't scrub words off, like, we can't scrub our identity off our website, or, we are a Black talk radio station that serves the Black community in Philadelphia. That is the predominant demographic in a major city. Black people are 43% of the city of Philadelphia. It is a Black and brown city. 70% of Philadelphia is Black, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. Almost 70%. So like, that's one of the things we have going for us, is that we are in a city that has a Black mayor, it has a Black police chief, it has like a lot of Black stakeholders, and the community sees our value in activating on the ground to empower and educate the Black community. But it's hard, and URL, like, it's all of my work is, I think all of our work is absolutely in the crosshairs and under threat, but we persevere.
I think what is exciting in this moment, and we were talking about this before, and why I'm excited to hear also about how you, when you talked about checking a box, the boxes of identity in the United States, right, you could argue work to separate, but in many ways they're essential to understanding where the harms have been. And what I'm interested in now, why I'm excited to be here and so thankful to be at this festival with all my international colleagues, is that there is an opportunity for collaboration, power building, and thinking beyond the boxes that are essential to understanding who's been harmed and how to mitigate, while at the same time thinking more broadly. And also that journalism, a lot of the panels that I've been noticing this week, there's still this desire to sort of focus on, well, if we just tell the good stories, it's going to address the moment. And I think we're in a unique moment where the stories are not going to save us. And that at some point there's a preponderance of evidence and a collective view of what is happening, that folks across so many places and countries, not just the United States, but around the world, are under threat. And so how must journalism respond? And part of the problem with mainstream journalism in the United States has been there's this separation, this notion of proximity, that if I am too close, too proximate to you, therefore I cannot cover you because I will be biased. The reality is all journalists are biased. We just can perhaps manage our subjectivity, understanding how we align across race and gender and class and geography shapes our perception, and how those perceptions are shapes our approach to the sources we pick, to the approach of coverage that we take. And so I think in this moment, there's something within journalism that needs to be unwound, pulled apart, rethought, and rebuilt. And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, and it would be good to do some of the rethinking here, right? And thank you for bringing up the boxes. As an outsider in America, and this is very much how this session came about, I always get incredibly confused when I look at that form that you have to fill, which says, Black, Latino, Caucasian, and I get stuck because I am from the Caucasus, and yet I cannot check the Caucasian box because being from the Caucasus and my identity is very much shaped by being a person who is constantly having to fight to tell their own story. In that case, the story of like resistance against the oppressor, the neighbor, the colonizer, in this case, Russia. In the United States, being Caucasian is being the dominant power, right? Which is not the world that I come from at all. And I see the same kind of boxing that happens in the mainstream media, right? And before the election, we heard about, the Black voters and Latino voters. And, do we need to start rethinking how we categorize ourselves without obviously taking away the identity, is this about assigning boxes that, this assignment of boxes by someone else is part of is part of the oppression. You know, when we live in, like, do we vote as women? Like, is there such thing as a black voter, or is there such thing as a female voter even?
Right. There's not. And that blunting of people can be used, or is often used as a tool to divide and conquer. It was very successful in Africa, for example, just to divide people so that they don't form coalitions. But I think in America, it worked in Black Americans' favor, that because we did not know where we came from tribally, or where we came from in the continent, we were just Black. If your skin was brown, you were Black. And being lumped all into that box obliterated a lot of infighting and made us work together, and has made us very powerful. And as I travel throughout Europe, and Sarah and I were together in Brazil, other countries and communities are still checking individual sub-boxes. I'm Black French, I'm West Indian, I'm West African, as opposed to just seeing yourself as a Black. And I feel that while there's a lot of erasure that goes when you just lump people in as defining them by their skin color, to your point, there can be strength in that. And I think in this time where they're using racism as a tool against us, that we can use the commonality as a source of strength.
Do you want to say something, or should I ask you a question?
No, go ahead, ask a question.
Like, is there a need to, yeah, go on.
I kind of want to say something because, this notion of the box, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but as a Black American, I don't realize how confined by that identity and how obsessed I am with race and racism until I go to a Black place, a Black country, and I realize how race and racism dominates like so much of my imagination, and I'm constantly scanning like, oh, they didn't look me in the eye, they're racist, it's really like the level of racial oppression that dominates our imagination is as Black Americans is kind of all-consuming. And so you have to work really hard to extricate yourself from that box. And so we have to, we have embraced art and culture, and we have found the spaces to create our own narratives, our own identities that expand the box and redefine who we are to ourselves, because we know that externally, a lot of times, what's projected onto us wants to keep us in this tiny box that is mostly associated with negative things.
But that is drawn by someone
else. Yeah. And so it's the box analogy is really interesting because sometimes the box is like in your mind. It's a mental framework, and you've got to figure out how to not allow what's projected onto you to keep you confined.
And there was this dinner last night where we had journalists from different countries, basically Black journalists, but from Canada, from Paris, from the Netherlands, from the United States, and somebody originally from Madagascar. And what was interesting in that moment, and I think so, we get caught up, and I agree with you that you're sort of so saturated by the impacts of this system that it dominates your thinking and perspective to such a degree. And the struggle and the muscle memory of struggle that emerged out of that. And for us, it's exhausting. But according to our colleagues in other places where there are fewer folks in more homogenous countries, they look to Black folks in the United States as beacons of struggle. And so we have to be reminded of that as well. And that that is a beautiful role that we can play, and that a place that we can offer inspiration at a time where it may feel so weighty for us.
I also think a lot about, who in this new setup are the allies and the enemies, right? Like, who do we align? Like, if we are to, because, to me, it seems like the battle is really existential. And in some ways, I agree with you completely that what's happening is incredibly clarifying, because, for people from my part of the world, journalists in places where freedoms are limited, whether by by someone outside who is trying to get you, or by your own authoritarian government, like, you don't have a choice of being like that. That idea of objectivity of journalism it doesn't exist. It's such a Western, like, white, Anglo-Saxon, whatever you call it, construct. Because if you are trying to tell your story and someone doesn't want you to tell your story, then you can't be objective, right? And you're basically, and I see a lot of my colleagues in the US who come from more mainstream and legacy publications now really struggling with this. And, to be honest, like, I come from very legacy background. I was always with the BBC, so these ideas of objectivity were, like, in me as well. But it's such a luxury to be able to be objective. And if someone is telling you that you can't do your job.
The objectivity framing, I think, is not, that's a myth too. Because like Martin said, everybody's coming to their work as journalists with a worldview, with a background. And so, I think that balance and, making sure that you are coming from a place of trying to tell an accurate story is great, but I think that it's a myth, and part of like the deconstructing of this moment and journalism we have to be honest with ourselves that a lot of times this idea of objectivity is maintaining a very specific worldview that's being projected onto what we're covering.
And the gaze, whose gaze is allowed to be
objective.
Yep, and the gaze through which the story or the narrative is told. And also in the U.S., this notion of objectivity was not rooted in altruistic intention, it was rooted in money. The intention of the more objective you can be, the more customers you can grow. It was, particularly in the newspaper business, it was really about growing audience and making revenue. It was not for some altruistic reason. And so I think we can't lose sight of the capitalistic intent that objectivity is rooted in, because it certainly isn't in, and I think so often about different generations. We teach a framework called fault lines, which talks about how we all see the world through these lenses of our identities and different forms of identity. And when I think about generation as being one of the most dynamic fault lines, and how different journalists of different generations are now thinking about their own identities. I'm a Gen Xer, clearly the best generation. And,
Hear, hear.
So, but you got millennials now who represent the largest constituency in workforce, who have a different relationship to identity, and certainly Gen Z coming up behind them are certainly not divesting their identity from the stories and the kind of journalism that they want to tell. I think that is great and can also be problematic. And so how do you find the balance of one's identity to the stories you tell? And then the big problem with news organizations, and particularly at these higher levels, is the higher up you go in an organization, and if you're a person of color, you would think that you can affect change, but in fact, the room gets thinner the higher you go, because you are a representation of that institution. And so it's why, you have a black police chief going into a police department and can't stop police brutality.
Yep.
Do you think across America, going back to the journalism activism question, do you think journalists need to become more of activists now?
Well, I mean, again, I come out of the Black media tradition, which, you know, its origins were in activism. You know, 1827, the first Black newspaper was started, Freedom's Journal by Samuel Cornish and John B. Russwurm. And 1827, so for non-Americans or people who don't know history, slavery did not end until 1865. So 1827, enslavement and Black people as chattel was in full effect. 1827, they were advocating, they started that newspaper to advocate for the humanity of Black people. And I see my work as a direct descendant of that advocacy. Like, we don't have the luxury of not advocating for our communities because our communities are consistently under threat.
And in the same way that a Ukrainian journalist doesn't have a luxury of covering the war with Russia objectively because it's a war, do you see that similarity?
Yeah.
Well, also, here's another thing, too. So in 2018, we did a convening before the midterms with community organizers and activists and with journalists, the goal both talking about the role that each plays in society. And one thing that was really interesting that the activists said is that, well, we're a lot more journalistic than you give us credit for, and you're a lot more activist than you want to admit. And I thought that that was really quite, and it is true, journalists are activists. They're activists for the First Amendment. You're activists for freedom of expression. You activate all the time. The issue is that, well, what are you activating around, and what issue is acceptable in this particular institution?
And I think that accountability is absolutely critical, because a lot of times people think that when you say activist or advocating, you are abdicating your responsibility for holding power to account. And I think that that is absolutely a fundamental aspect of journalism and a fundamental responsibility of Black media as well. Like, we're not just being, like, you know, activist. We are trying to educate, inform, and empower our communities so they can better navigate an unfair and unjust system. And we also are holding people accountable. At the end of the day, I think that, you know, the core guiding light for us is how do we best serve our audience? How do we best serve our community? What do they need? What are the gaps in information? And whether that sounds like activism or advocacy, I don't know, but that's the driving force for the work that we do. And for Word, it's the Black community in Philadelphia. For URL, it's these Black and brown media outlets that need more visibility, need more revenues. But how do we serve our communities in ways, because a lot of our audiences, our communities, have been historically and chronically under-resourced, undercovered.
What are the perils of proximity? Yeah.
Well, I'll speak on, I work in film festivals. I've worked for both mainstream film festivals and Black and brown film festivals. And the conversations in the programming rooms, deciding which stories are going to get told, are very different in both of those organizations. And it is a lot of heartburn and heartache when you're working for a Tribeca or a Sundance to stop telling the stories about the Black drug dealer and the Black single mother and the war-torn African children with flies around their faces. But it is a constant struggle to correct the narrative. So as a programmer and the programmers of color that I work with, we are committed to correcting the story and advocating for our communities by correcting the stories that are always being told about us. It is a joy to work for Black film festivals, the smaller festivals. I was the festival director of Urban World, which is a New York City-based film festival that was born when the founder went to Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival, and said, why aren't there more black films here? And they said, they're not, we don't see any good black films. So it is wonderful to work with black and brown filmmakers who are telling stories about our families and our struggles and our triumphs, but on a more holistic basis. They are, like black and brown media, tragically and woefully underfunded. So the struggle
and obviously
is,
will be much more so now in this new political reality.
Sure, and so there are parallels, as you're talking about proximity. Films and filmmakers want to get into Berlin and Cannes and Sundance because that's where the prestige is, that's where you're going to get, the money, that's where you're going to get your film sold. Yet the value of exhibiting authentic stories in a black and brown space, I'm very worried at this juncture that they're going under, these festivals are going under.
So I think what we have in common is that what I have in common with a lot of people from, whether it's journalists in Ukraine or journalists in places like Kenya, these are stories that are hard to put on the map. The same, you've made an incredible progress in the United States with putting yourselves on, reclaiming your story. A lot of it is now being rolled back in really dramatic ways, including the funding and, the resources and everything else. This is going to be a completely new era and a completely new world. We need to be coming up with new narratives. You said that. We need the money to be coming up with the new narratives. I think we also need the new alliances to be coming up with new narratives. How are you thinking about that? What new collaborations, what new links do we need to be making to survive what is like a very global rise of authoritarian networks?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I was very excited to come to this festival and have conversations like we had last night, to understand, because I think that in the United States so often there's a lack of visibility and connection beyond this ecosystem. In many ways, we sort of view the country as it's so large, so much of the world often looks to the States in certain ways, and we get caught up in that as well, and sort of thinking about our own struggles and challenges. And I think in this moment, we have a lot to learn also about other countries. Many across this continent have been navigating authoritarian regimes for years. There's a lot for us to learn and to understand. And so I think connecting more intentionally with our colleagues around the globe, understanding that also journalists, and we can learn this from black media and ethnic media, is this notion of struggle, power building and organizing, which is not something that in particularly journalists can barely organize them damn selves. The unions are pathetic. There's a lot to learn around this notion of struggle. And so I think doing that in terms of connecting with black media and then also journalists from across the globe that have navigated this kind of government. That's what I'm excited to see come out of this conversation and this experience.
And Karen, and for you in the culture space, because culture is also such a front line, right, and being attacked, where are you seeing, where is it going?
Well, in terms of funding, the rollback in funding that these DEI slashing is gonna, how it's going to affect filmmakers is really drastic. But I think it is an opportunity for black festivals and black filmmakers to get out of this knee-jerk. We've been trained to kind of go to the white guy, go to the white people for money and funding. As black Americans, that has been, the legacy of slavery is they have the money and the power, and we have to constantly ask them for that. Black Americans have amassed a good amount of wealth. And if we reach across to Africans, there are plenty, Nigerians are very wealthy, have great resources and great film industry, South Africa, you know, there's a lot of money on the continent. So if we can look, if we can shift our gaze back to our roots, I think we can find some resources there.
I would say, yeah, absolutely, like Pan-African coalition building is essential, and there's a legacy of that as well. You know, there was Marcus Garvey, who had the UNIA movement. There's W.E.B. Du Bois, who started to become more Pan-African as he aged. There's Malcolm X, who started, you know, OAAU, the Organization of African American Unity. And these are African American figures who were looking around the world to create a Pan-African movement, and I think that we are in that moment right now because resources are drying up. I do want to speak to the, so URL was born, it's Black and Brown Media Organizations, was born out of the 2020 racial justice protests. And so it was at the height of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. That was, nobody's saying BIPOC, you know, it's like, ooh, a dirty word now, but that was like the framing coming out of 2020, that there was this coalition of Black and Brown. And I'll tell you, after the 2024 election, the results of that election were really heartbreaking. And the numbers that kind of blew up this romantic notion of Black and Brown solidarity was incredibly jarring. And so when we look at, I think 52% of Latinos voted for Trump. You know, when we look at 53 or 50-something% of white women voted for Trump. I'm proud to say 92% of Black women voted for Kamala Harris. But this idea of like, and it goes kind of to your boxes.
Yeah,
like,
I was going to say, does it mean there's time for new boxes?
Well, and I think that, you know, like it's something that at URL, we were always very intentional about not romanticizing this like Black and Brown, because there's a lot of anti-Black racism in brown communities, in the Latino community, in the Asian American. There's a lot of anti-Black racism because of the racial hierarchy that America has imposed on America and the world. So
well, and there's plenty of racism and hierarchies in other places with
absolutely
caste systems and
absolutely,
you know, all sorts of.
And so I'll finish this point by saying that despite the heartbreak of that, of the results out of that election, and really the fissures, and Black people, a lot of Black people were like, oh, we gotta like pull up the bridge, and we need to just like huddle up because we're in this alone. Despite that instinct, I still deeply believe that we have to coalition build, because even though 50% or 52% of Americans voted for Trump, there are a lot of people who didn't. And so my belief is I want to double down on coalition building with anyone who is about Black liberation. I don't care what you look like. I don't care where you're from.
But should it be Black liberation, or should it be globally liberation?
It's globally liberation,
liberation.
but if you have Black liberation, this is my 2 cents, you will have global liberation.
I was just recommended a book called When Irish Became White, so
Okay.
Along the same lines. Let's take a couple of questions. Yes, I'm on.
So much. I've been told to stand up, which is why I'm standing up. Otherwise, I could just sit here and talk. My name is Mona Al-Tahawi. I'm the author of the newsletter Feminist Giant. And I'm from Egypt, and I moved to the US in 2000. And I trained in journalism at the American University in Cairo. And one of the things that we were trained in was the US media is a great example of the media as watchdog. And I've spent the past 25 years in the US watching the US media, the legacy media you've been talking about, be the lapdog, not the watchdog, you know? And this whole idea of shock is basically because white-dominated newsrooms, like most white people in the US, always thought this kind of tyranny and fascism was something that happened to Black and brown people far away, and they somehow deserved this tyrant. And it would never happen to white people. And so, especially for me as a feminist, when I see that the way that they cover these white Christian nationalist women and the way that they're foot soldiers for fascism and patriarchy. And I see how they cover Muslim women. And I'm like, you know how to cover women who do this, but you can only do it for brown Muslim women, but you can't do it for white women, you know? So, I mean, like, I'm one of those stereotypical, this is more of a comment than a question people, because I'm so fucking enraged at, you know, what is happening in the United States right now, and white people being shocked, and we're like, hello, why did you think you were so special, you know? What's so special about you other than your whiteness? And it's like, welcome to the rest of the world. And I've been talking to friends.
This is the cue.
Martin,
Go on.
Go ahead. I've been, last sentence, I promise. I've been talking to friends about having a session like this with journalists from countries that had tyranny, so we can train white journalists how to do it, you know?
So Martin has a framework that he's been using. Go ahead, Martin, say it.
All right, well, this is a framework. We all niggas now.
No, only black people. Let's be clear. Only black people can say the N-word.
I'm just gonna be real about it.
No, I don't want to hear niggas out of anybody else's mouth that's not black.
That's the framework. We all niggas now.
That's the subtitle of this panel.
And I know that you can say that that's harsh, but there's, when I think about the implications of that, right? That the outrage that we're seeing now as institutions are being eroded, folks' healthcare is being attacked, people are seeing all of a sudden livelihoods destroyed, being oppressed, things being wiped away. And I'm like, this is what black folks have navigated for so long. So let us all work together, come together, understand how we are aligned and connected. Otherwise,
Otherwise, bad, yeah.
We're all going down.
we all going down.
One more question. Quick one in the back, yeah.
Hi, I'm also unfortunately not asking a question, but making a remark. But I'll keep it short. My name is Saada Nurse, and I'm chief editor of One World magazine based in Amsterdam. We're the only black-owned magazine in the Netherlands, unfortunately. But I just wanted to say, a panel that is called Am I Black Enough? There shouldn't be questions from moderators questioning the blackness part of this conversation. So I was really kind of irritated by the fact that it was brought back to other people. This is a panel about black experience globally, and of course it can be tied to colonialism and all that stuff, but for these knowledgeable people that I had a lovely dinner with last night, to be having to defend this subject is annoying. That's all I wanted to say.
So,
I don't want you to defend me. I think I should defend myself. A fair point. Thank you for that comment. I think what we wanted to tease out, it's true. I actually struggled because what I wanted to tease out, and I was telling these guys earlier how, you know, I spent time in Senegal as a student living with a host family, and I really relate, I had this very bonding experience with my host brother, because I realized then for the first time that he had exact same relationship with French as I had with Russian. For him, it was the language of oppressor that also gave him access to things. So what I really wanted to do is to have a conversation that went beyond, that was about oppression as a unifying, as kind of a unifying theme that can help us create new alliances that don't exist now, because we tend to talk to each other through our oppressors around the world. That prevents us from building resistance movements, because,
So I want to jump in because I appreciate that comment, and I appreciate the irritation. I do. Because if I was sitting out there, I'd probably be feeling the same. If I didn't know Natalia and I didn't know everybody, I'd probably be like, This is the white chick questioning the black people, But I will say, we have this panel, real talk. This panel is happening because Natalia put it together. She pitched it, she got it accepted. We would not be having this conversation in this space if Natalia had not, you know,
Can you
helped
quickly
put
say
it together.
why we came up with the name that we came up with?
We came up with
because
Am I
it
Black?
was about beyond, you know, it was around that conversation
Right,
that oppression surpasses the boxes.
It was, and again, we had this conversation in December. It was the beginning of December, so Trump had been elected, but he had not been inaugurated, he had not been installed. And so we had no idea that we were gonna be in the kind of reality that we're in right now. We knew that it was bad, but we didn't know it was gonna be this bad. And so, you know, the idea was, the title is Am I Black Enough for You, it was the title of a song in the US in the 70s. And the concept was, how could we, because at that time, like, real talk, when I talk about black stuff, I was at a conference in Iceland, and I was talking about my experience as a black American. People didn't care. People were like, eye roll, collective shrug. There is a devaluing of the black American experience. It's like, get over it. You got Obama, what else? We gotta, okay. I'm gonna wrap it up, he's giving me the hook. But we wanted to construct a conversation that did go beyond the black American experience, because there is this numbing out of our collective experience. And we wanted to have a broader conversation about what blackness outside of race looks like around the world. And so, you know, like, I am grateful that we had this conversation. We're wrapping it up. Thank you all for coming, and thank you. We can continue outside. You can like trip Natalia outside.